Okay, 3, 2, 1, it's jam.
Life. What is it? How did it begin? These big fat questions are the questions we're going to try to answer in this session today. My name is Sir Ramon and this is Science with Sir Ramon. Let's do this, science fam. So our topic is the origins of life and the unifying themes of life. So what are we up to in this session? We're going to explain some of the concepts of life based on the evidence and experiments that people tried to do in order to figure them out, describe classic experiments that led to those evidences and those concepts of life, and to describe some of the unifying themes that explain how life is just one unified concept. So again, where did life come from? What did life come from? What was there before life? These are huge questions, and some of the early answers to this are from the great minds of people who are using just logic and reason, the philosophers. So a lot of these are philosophical theories, some of them are scientific. These are the theories on the origins of life and how we figured stuff out. So the earliest theory for the origin of life is something we're all kind of familiar with. We're going with creationism. We're talking about creationism. Life is a divine creation. According to creationism, and it's not scientifically accepted, not because it's been disproven, but because it cannot be disproven. You can't use, there's no way to get evidence or get evidence against creationism. You can't disprove God because God is by definition beyond all logic. Okay? So creationism theories, whether it's Catholic, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, these are things that cannot be encapsulated or studied through science. So it's still, one of the theories that we have to take note of, that there are explanations of where life came from based on religion. Next, we have the philosophers. So the philosophers use logic and reason in order to figure stuff out, and the first of the theories is spontaneous generation. This guy is Aristotle. Doesn't look very wise because, they weren't super into painting really well that time, but he said that life can spontaneously arise from non-living matter. And as one of the primary and most forward-thinking people, primary thinkers and most forward-thinking people of his time, people kind of took his word for it, that life can come from non-living matter. One example is how from the river Nile, whenever it floods the banks of the river, field mice would rise up from the mud. So everybody thought mice come from mud. So this is the basis of one of the theories, one of the big overarching theories of the origins of life, called abiogenesis, or life from non-living matter. So again, the early theory is spontaneous generation. The big picture theory is abiogenesis. Alright, so next, after Aristotle, how did the theory develop? Much later, some guy named Francesco Redi used rotting meat, and because the general consensus was that rotting meat would produce maggots. That's life from non-living matter because it's dead meat. But Francesco Redi made an experiment where he has a sealed flask, a flask covered with just gauze that can let air through, and a flask that has no cover at all. And he figured out that, sealing a flask, even if the meat is rotting, won't produce maggots. A flask covered with gauze would have maggots on top of the gauze, and an open flask would have the maggots and flies there. So he figured out, number one, that maggots are not separate from flies. They're actually the larvae or the baby flies. And two, that life comes from life. He was the one who started chipping at the idea of abiogenesis, that living things come from non-living things. So he made the Latin maxim omne vivum ex vivo, or all life possibly comes from life. So again, the concept, the theory, starts here with Redi's experiment. So some disagreed with Redi's conclusion and went to back up spontaneous generation. So science, they like to have feuds. So this guy, John Needham, said that bacteria must come from spontaneous generation, and he designed an experiment to prove his point. So he had a flask, he boiled it over here, and then after boiling it, eventually it still became cloudy because of bacteria. Now he had another flask and he boiled it again, and still, bacteria, even if the flask was sealed with a cork. So he said that when you boil flasks and then they're still sealed, that means that the living factor came from the non-living factors inside the flask. But the thing is, he didn't account for the existence of heat-resistant spores of bacteria and microorganisms. There are things that can resist the killing power of heat. All right, so yeah, John Needham said, "Oh, living matter can come from non-living matter." But another dude stepped into the ring to shut down Needham. This guy is Lazarus Palanzani. I can't pronounce his name. Whatever, that's a spelling. So what he did is he properly boiled and sealed the flasks, this time for longer and at a higher temperature than Needham did, and basically same experiment, but better heating. What happened is that the sealed flask was free of microorganisms after being allowed to proliferate for some days after heating. So he kind of proved that stuff only started growing inside a heated flask, a properly heated flask, when it was unsealed again. So his theory is that microbes and bacteria moved through the air and could be killed by proper boiling. So, this guy said, no, living things have to come from living things, and they're probably just floating around in the air and they're too tiny for us to see. So he's, getting to the point. But then Needham argued that the generating force, or the generative life-giving force, was destroyed by Spallanzani's procedure. The non-living matter from which living matter can come from was supposedly destroyed. But it's the living things that got killed, not the non-living things getting destroyed. So Needham's still trying to defend spontaneous generation, but there's already Spallanzani. There's another guy that comes in to give the final nail in the coffin of abiogenesis in the early days. So much later, someone laid the matter to rest. So for sure, life does not spring up from non-living things willy-nilly. So this guy came in, Louis Pasteur. So he had a setup where he had a cotton air filter that he just allowed to collect the air through nature, and he showed that there are microorganisms in the air by capturing microorganisms in that cotton air filter. Second experiment, he had swan neck flasks. So these flasks with special necks that look like swan necks because they have a bend. That bend prevents the outside world from going into the flask if microbes are transported via air, because the wind cannot go into the flask at an appreciable rate if it's in that shape, the swan neck shape. So what he showed was basically the same as Palanzani. If you heat a flask and then you let it ferment, you let anything that's living there proliferate, there would be no bacteria if the swan neck is there. If you remove the swan neck and allow air to contaminate the flask, bacteria will grow. And if you tilt the flask sideways and let it sit for a while in the curve of the neck so that it comes into contact with the outside world and then put it back, bacteria will be present again. So his experiment proved once and for all that bacteria come from air, outside air. And you can pasteurize, or basically, sanitize setup by using heat, lots and lots of heat. But if all life comes from life, where did the first life come from? See, this is the thing where biogenesis, the idea that life comes from living matter, cannot win over everybody. Okay, so there has to be a very first life that must have come from non-living matter, and these are some of the theories that explain how this happened. So first we have the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis, or also known as the primordial soup hypothesis. So this is suggesting that the molecules of life arose from what we call chemical evolution. Random chemicals that are in the primordial soup of early Earth, meaning the conditions of early Earth, met together and just randomly decided to react in a way that produces molecules that are self-replicating. Again, just enough energy, just enough volatility, just the right mix of chemicals to allow molecules that are self-replicating to suddenly come into existence. So non-living into the first steps of living matter. So one evidence of this are the conditions of hydrothermal vents. So the vents in the bottom of the ocean where magma flows forth, these have high temperatures and lots of inorganic compounds that come from the mantle of the earth and they actually create good conditions for basic biomolecules like amino acids and nucleic acids to actually come from inorganic matter. So this is like the second wind of abiogenesis. So an experiment that helped make Oparin-Haldane hypothesis a legit thing is the Miller-Urey experiment. So they tested it out by having this kind of setup. They had a setup for Earth's early oceans. It's literally just a flask of water that's shoving water vapor into another flask that has basic organic molecules. So they're not living molecules. They're super basic molecules that aren't necessarily made by living things, like methane, CH4. It's organic because it has carbon and hydrogen bonds, but it's not made by living things all of the time. There's also some amines, some hydrogen, and they introduced lightning through electrodes. So introduced electric shocks inside that flask. So we have Earth's early oceans, the lightning in the atmosphere, and the Earth's early atmosphere, which had many different types of gases, supposedly would have the right conditions to create simple organic compounds. And they found that yes, they were able to make chunks of organic compounds, not living things or living matter yet, but the biomolecules necessary for life. Again, let's emphasize that there's no actual life created there, but they did produce amino acids. So another theory that's also kind of related to the primordial soup theory is the RNA world hypothesis. See, the thing here is that they made amino acids, but amino acids have to polymerize, meaning they have to come together to make proteins. And actually forming polymers of proteins out of amino acids takes a long-ass time, much longer than the age of the Earth, if you don't have enzymes. And enzymes are things made by living things, so, that's the problem. So, another hypothesis is that maybe we didn't start out with proteins. Maybe we started out with nucleic acids like RNA. The reason for this is that RNA can do a lot of things. It can store genetic information and interpret it when it's in the form of what we call ribozymes. These are basically RNA that can act as enzymes. So, it can act on itself. Aside from storing information, it can use itself in order to catalyze chemical reactions. So, it helps explain how we can have catalyzed chemical reactions, but RNA is very hard to make. So actually getting RNA is another problem that we have for explaining the primordial soup hypothesis. Now, another theory is the clay theory. In the 1980s, some dude had a theory that maybe the crystalline structure of clay helps as a mold or a framework for compounds to become self-replicating. Now, everybody just kind of chucked the idea out the window because it didn't make much sense until 2009. A bunch of people used Montmorillonite clay, very similar to bentonite clay that you use in facial washes, to catalyze the formation of actual RNA polymers. In other words, apparently it did make sense. They just didn't look for the proper clay. So Montmorillonite clay can catalyze the formation of polymers of RNA. So that kind of, helps this theory along as well. So that's the interesting thing. So where else could life have come from aside from a primordial soup of early Earth? So we also have another hypothesis, the Panspermia Hypothesis. Be mature, guys. This is the hypothesis that biomolecules or microorganisms may have come from outer space. Yeah, from asteroids. So it implies that there is an interplanetary or perhaps even interstellar ecosystem. So that means the biosphere is not just on Earth. So it's pretty wild. We haven't even found evidence of life outside of Earth. So there's no concrete supporting evidence yet, but it's an interesting theory, and it helps get rid of a lot of the problems with the other theories that we just discussed. But this also doesn't actually explain the origin of all life. So if it came from outer space, then how did it form in outer space? That's something we can't explain using Panspermia Hypothesis. But, it's cool enough that Japan went and set out on a mission in order to see if there's any possibility for this hypothesis. They call it the Tanpopo mission. Tanpopo is the Japanese word for dandelion. It's like how the dandelion seeds can get blown by the wind and scatter across the earth. Maybe, just maybe, biomolecules were blown away through the stars by some sort of interstellar wind. So it has a two-part mission. First, to capture cosmic dust and see if there is organic molecules in cosmic dust or perhaps bacteria. And number two, to expose bacteria to outer space to see if they can survive. Now, we don't have results for number one yet. We haven't captured cosmic dust with organic molecules, but the exposed bacteria that was exposed to outer space using different thicknesses of different layers of layers with different thickness of aerogel, the least dense solid material on Earth. They put bacteria under it in different thickness, and then they found that there's some species of bacteria where even if it's a very thin aerogel layer, they can actually survive in space because the dead bacteria on top kind of protect the bacteria underneath it from radiation and all the other stuff that kills living things. So it's possible for bacterial clumps to travel through space. So that's the result so far. Now, what makes it so difficult to find out where life came from? Now, these are some of the challenges that are present in all of the theories of the origins of life. First, there's polymerization. Forming long molecules is very hard, and you need catalysts. You need things to speed up reactions for it to actually happen. Again, Earth isn't old enough for it to happen without catalysts. So, you need an explanation for that. Second is the early Earth atmosphere. In the Miller-Urey experiment, they proposed a highly reducing environment. This means that there's redox reactions going around. Electrons are being ripped off of molecules and put somewhere else. But most geologists have found that early Earth was almost neutral and not highly reducing. So where did they get that chemically reactive atmosphere? And third, we have the concept of homochirality. See, biomolecules have like a left and right-handed type thing. Okay, that's chirality. Some of them are left-handed, some of them are right-handed. Naturally, these molecules form with a 50% chance to be left-handed or 50% right-handed. But inside living things, almost everything has a theme of homochirality, meaning they have the same handedness. Like, for example, all of the carbohydrates you have are left-handed, stuff like that. It doesn't make sense if they naturally form with 50% chance. There has to be something that allowed for all of them to have the same handedness. So these three, once you explain these, you're on your way to finding out what is the origin of life. But until then, it's a mystery. So even if our origins aren't clear, we can still say that life is a unified concept by some common themes. So these are some of the unifying themes of life that tie life together. First theme, life is organized. New properties also emerge at higher complexities of biological organization. On the left, we see that from the atom, it can organize into molecules, then to organelles, then to cells, and so on. So it gets more and more complicated as you go on. So we won't get into detail on that, but the main takeaway is that there are emergent properties. This means that at higher levels of organization, life, or at least, this stuff is capable of more things. For example, a molecule has more properties than an atom, and a cell can sustain itself much better than an organelle can. Another theme in biological organization is structure and function. At all levels, the structure or the shape of your actual thing helps it function in a certain way. So even molecules like proteins, if they're not folded in the proper way, they won't do the job that they're supposed to do. Your cells have to have specific shapes in order for them to do their jobs well. Some of them are cube-shaped, some of them are spherical shaped. It depends on what they need to do. And it goes on and on and on until the biosphere level. So again, there are always emergent properties, and there's always structure correlating with function in order to say that life is organized. Next theme, life's processes involve genetic information. There's always a molecule that holds the genetic information. All life that we've seen so far has DNA as the primary genetic material. Now, there's so much info in DNA, in full genomes, full sets of DNA in organisms, that new fields like genomics and bioinformatics arise. These are basically data science fields where they use data science, big numbers, big data, huge terabytes of information are analyzed all at the same time to find connections between different species, for example. So this is extremely useful for things like finding out where the coronavirus came from. They had to analyze different sequences of bats, different sequences of coronavirus, and so on and so forth. This is how life can be coded for. Next theme, life requires the transfer and transformation of energy and matter. So life has metabolism, meaning it processes things, both energy and matter. So again, metabolism is basically all the chemical processes of life. So you can't say that something is alive if it doesn't metabolize, if it doesn't process energy and matter. And generally, energy flows one way through an ecosystem. Sunlight comes in through the plants, and then the plants get eaten, and the animals get eaten, and eventually all the light, all the energy from sunlight goes out of the ecosystem as heat. Matter, on the other hand, is recycled through chemical processes. So because of all the eating and the pooping, fertilizing stuff, matter can be recycled. You don't chuck matter out. What's another species waste is another species food source. So matter is always recycled. So again, life requires energy and matter. Next theme, interactions are important in biological system. No man is an island, and especially not a species. Almost everything is interconnected and interacts with each other. So interactions between the components of an ecosystem keep the system going. From the tiny examples like molecules inside organisms, they interact with each other to regulate processes and maintain what we call homeostasis. Homeostasis means steady state, meaning the just right, the Goldilocks set of circumstances that makes it just right for life. Again, homeostasis, maintaining that steady state. Ecosystems, on the other hand, also have a tend to balance their species diversity through the interactions between the different living things, like some eat other things, and how they interact with the environment. They're what we call ecosystem engineers that can change an environment just on their activities, like beavers and their dams. So again, interactions are very important to life. And the core theme that brings everything together in life, it explains why different kinds of life exists and why there are similarities in all these different types of life. It's evolution. Evolution accounts for both unity and diversity. So natural selection is the driving force that results in different life forms. If you have different environments, different pressures for natural selection, you get different forms of life. But since all of these different forms of life come from common ancestors, that's why on the molecular and cellular level there are similarities that you can find in all types of life. So even if we make machines that can replicate themselves, Horizon Zero Dawn, they replicate themselves, they can respond to stimuli, they're still not considered alive because they're not made of cells. They don't evolve in the same way that life does. And so we can say that life is complex. So complex that it doesn't have a clear-cut definition as of yet. The best definitions we have are just talking about the characteristics of life, like the themes that we've discussed so far. So it's that complex. And it's also beautiful because at every stage of its organization, there's more and more uniqueness, more and more capacity to go against the darkness of the night. Life is a process that creates order out of chaos. And yet, it's also ruthless. Because, if you look at evolution, in order to get this diversity of life, many more species had to die and become extinct. So life is also ruthless. In other words, life is a big thing to discuss, and this life science part of our course is going to be a doozy. So I hope you guys can be patient and learn a lot, and I'll see you guys next time.
Party over.